I'm very pleased that you're holding this hearing because the Senate Foreign Relations Committee can help bridge the gap between domestic U.S. climate legislation and the international effort dealing with forests necessary to deal with one of the great challenges of our time. I've been working with Environmental Defense Fund, the Nature Conservancy, Conservation International, Defenders of Wildlife, the Wildlife Conservation Society, and major corporations including Shell, AIG, PG&E, AEP, and Duke Energy to make sure that in any U.S. legislation dealing with climate change that domestic and international forest carbon initiatives are included. Two important observations at the beginning. First, the forest sector is critical to dealing with climate change. As you've all recognized, it accounts for 20% of global greenhouse gas emissions. But to put that in context, that means it is the second largest source of carbon emissions, second only to actual burning of fossil fuels, and it's more than the entire global transportation sector combined. If one looks at the world's top emitters, such as Indonesia and Brazil, they've achieved that rank not because of their industrialization, but largely because of the emissions associated with deforestation. We can't solve the climate change problem if forests are not included. The scientific case is unmistakable. We can't stabilize the atmosphere at anything remotely close to what scientists believe is necessary if we leave 20% of global emissions out of the effort. But there's also a secondary benefit, and that is by protecting forests, we also conserve biodiversity. Tropical forests are home to half of the world's terrestrial species and also are important to the livelihood of the world's rural poor. The political case is equally strong. As I'll discuss in a moment, one of the ways to break the logjam that Senator Barroso mentioned, for example, with China and India, is to incentivize developing countries to break out of the lockstep that I confronted in Kyoto that China and India had by giving developing countries who have forests an incentive through avoided deforestation credits to protect their forests. That is their contribution and could serve as a sectoral model for electric power and transportation. Bringing climate change policy through deforestation would also provide linkages between any ultimate U.S. cap and trade program that we may have and countries that are already part of Kyoto or a post-Kyoto treaty. I believe, unfortunately, that in the near term we're not going to have two-thirds in the Senate to pass a treaty, and therefore we have to find linkages between an ultimate U.S. piece of legislation and international trading markets. Recognizing credits for reduced emissions from deforestation can bridge the divide with our international partners. The economic case is absolutely compelling because this is a low-cost mitigation option. It is a way that regulated companies in the U.S. can cheaply reduce their costs of compliance. It's flexible, and by putting it in our cap and trade system and providing international trading in forestry credits, it will mean both incentivizing developing countries to participate, but also lowering the cost of compliance. Permit me to suggest that there are two ways in which to finance efforts to reduce emissions from deforestation. One is to create an international fund, a government-to-government fund. This would be, in effect, foreign assistance provided by a number of countries. The second would be market-based mechanisms to channel private sector capital to developing countries to protect their forests. Now, frankly, I think we need both, but it is sophistry to expect that we can get a fund large enough. Sir Nicholas Stern, for example, feels we'll need up to $10 billion per year to provide adequate incentives for developing countries to protect their forests. To do that alone by foreign assistance, we need to harness the carbon market, which last year was some $60 billion, to deliver capital on a scale needed to have an impact on the problem. And Senator Lugar, I'm on the board of Chicago Climate Exchange and very much appreciate what you're doing, but we need to harness that kind of market. Now, what Bali did, Mr. Chairman, as you alluded to in the forest area, is it recognized for the first time, which we did not fully do at Kyoto, that any climate change regime following Kyoto has to include provisions for what they called reduce emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, or RED. The Bali Action Plan specifically references incentives to reduce emissions from deforestation and forest degradation in developing countries, and that's a huge step forward because now the international community is clearly recognizing that efforts to conserve the world's tropical and subtropical forests have to be part of any long-term global effort for climate change mitigation. This is in no small part due to the remarkable efforts of a group of over a dozen developing countries in the Coalition for Rainforest Nations. These are countries who are themselves the stewards of tropical and subtropical forests where most of the emissions of CO2 are coming from in the forest area. They're saying their part in dealing with climate change will be to take specific, measurable commitments to avoid deforestation if they're provided in an international regime with sufficient incentives to do so. And hopefully, as we'll discuss in the question period, with the tremendous pressures on commodity prices, the tremendous pressures to cut those forests down and grow soybeans and other products, we've got to provide a counterweight so that they don't have an incentive to cut the forest down and leave it all to agriculture. Now, the opportunities for U.S. leadership, and this will be my close, to take a lead on deforestation is to do the following, and that is that any cap-and-trade legislation, Lieberman-Warner or any variation thereof, should include provisions to recognize credits from reduced emissions from deforestation in developing countries. Congress can design legislation to allow credits for reduced emissions from deforestation to be traded in a U.S. cap-and-trade system in a manner ensuring environmental integrity. 3 ways, and then I'll close. First, in the current version of Lieberman-Warner, it allocates 2.5% of total emission allowances to international forest carbon activities. That percentage could be even increased more. Second, and even more important, the current Lieberman-Warner bill allows regulated entities to satisfy 15% of their compliance obligations with allowances from foreign greenhouse gas trading markets. This should be expanded beyond 15%, but even more critical is I urge this committee in the strongest terms to include in that provision expressly allowing forestry credits to be counted in that 15% or whatever ultimate percentage is selected. And third is to include provisions in a U.S. cap-and-trade bill that provide incentives to developing countries to move toward what you suggested, Mr. Chairman, which is a national accounting baseline system so we can measure forests. And if they do so, they should not be subject to any quantitative limitations in their ability to trade credits for avoided deforestation. The long and the short of it is this is a win-win situation for everybody. It lowers the cost of compliance by regulated companies in the U.S. It provides incentives for developing countries to take actual specific obligations. And it will provide a huge boost in dealing with climate change, reducing our costs in the U.S. and incentivizing countries abroad to participate. So thank you again for the opportunity, and I'll look forward to your questions when the panel has the opportunity to fully give their testimony.
Thank you, Ambassador.